Iowa, 1944. The truck slowed to a crawl along a dirt road, cutting through fields so vast they seemed to curve with the earth itself. Through gaps in the canvas covering, German prisoners pressed their faces against the frame, watching the landscape roll past. They had been told what to expect: hard labour, starvation rations, revenge for what their country had done. What they saw instead made them freeze. A machine the size of a small building moved across a field, pulling 12 ploughs at once, turning earth in perfect furrows that stretched to the horizon. The engine sound was deeper than any tank they'd ever heard. For a moment, no one breathed. Everything they had been taught, everything they believed about German superiority, about American weakness, about industrial capacity itself, was about to shatter. The journey had begun 6 weeks earlier, on a cold morning in Tunisia. Hauptmann Werner Schultz stood among 800 men in a makeshift holding camp outside Bizerte, his iron cross still visible beneath layers of desert dust. He was 34, a Panzer officer who had fought from Poland to North Africa, leading Tiger tanks across landscapes that had become graveyards for lesser machines. Around him, infantry soldiers, mechanics, artillery crews, even a metallurgist from Essen, all captured as Rommel's Afrika Korps collapsed under Allied pressure. They had expected execution. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were soft, undisciplined, incapable of real warfare. Their equipment was mass-produced garbage, quantity over quality, the desperate flailing of a mongrel nation that couldn't build anything worth building. Instead, they received medical examinations, surprisingly decent food, and work uniforms stamped with PW in white paint. The letters felt like brands. The ship crossing was worse than fear. Crowded holds, the constant pitch and roll of waves beneath steel decks. Men prayed in whispers, clutching photographs of farms they might never see again. Werner kept a small notebook, hiding it in his boot, writing by moonlight through portholes. April 3rd, 1944. We are told, we go to America. I cannot imagine what America will be. The American heartland hit them like a revelation when the train doors opened in New York. Not bombed ruins, not rationed cities clinging to survival, but something alive and impossibly abundant. Buildings reaching toward the sky. Cars everywhere, civilian cars, more vehicles in one street than some German towns had total. Electric lights blazing at night as if fuel were infinite, and people, well-fed people, walking with a confidence that came from never having bombed shelters become their second home. American guards lined the platform. This was the first shock. These men looked nothing like the propaganda posters. No weak-chinned cowards, no hesitant boys playing at war. They stood relaxed but alert, their uniforms clean, weapons maintained with obvious care. One guard, built like a farmhand with hands the size of dinner plates, helped an older German who stumbled on the platform steps. His grip was firm, but not cruel. Werner watched this and felt something shift in his understanding of the enemy. The transport trucks were open-sided, allowing air to move as they drove west through country that redefined scale. Endless farmland, broken only by grain silos that looked like cathedrals, fields so large you couldn't see their boundaries, barns bigger than German military warehouses, and everywhere, machinery. Tractors in quantities that seemed impossible, combines harvesting wheat in formations that reminded Werner of tank columns. "Where is the war damage?" Klaus Hoffmann whispered in German. He was 22, a machine gunner from Bavaria, still young enough to believe the Reich's promises about American industrial weakness. No one answered. There was no war damage. The homeland was untouched, producing at full capacity while Europe burned. The guards driving the trucks didn't speak much German, but their silence wasn't hostile. They simply drove, occasionally passing water and cigarettes back when men asked. One guard, noticing several prisoners staring at a passing farm, said something to his colleague and laughed. Not cruel laughter. The kind that comes from seeing something obvious that others are missing. These small interactions confused the prisoners more than cruelty would have. The camp emerged from cornfields like something from another world. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across cleared land, surrounded by wire fences that seemed almost casual compared to the fortifications of military installations. Guard towers stood at intervals, but the guards inside read magazines, drank coffee, looked more bored than vigilant. The camp commander was a major named Robert Harrison, a man from Kansas with the practical manner of someone who'd spent more time managing farms than fighting wars. He stood on the camp headquarters steps as the trucks arrived, his uniform showing the wear of someone who worked alongside his men. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said through a translator. His voice was matter-of-fact, businesslike. "You will work on local farms during planting and harvest seasons. You will be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip. You will be fed American rations. Follow the rules, obey the guards, and you'll find life here tolerable. Cause trouble, and you'll find it considerably less so." The German prisoners stood in formation, spring sun warming after months of desert heat, trying to process these words. Paid. Fed American rations. Working farms, not breaking rocks in some punishment detail. It had to be a trick. Some elaborate deception before the real treatment began. Major Harrison dismissed them to their barracks. The buildings were simple, but sturdy. Wooden bunks with real mattresses, footlockers for personal items they didn't have, wood stoves for heating, windows with actual glass. In the corner of each barracks, a radio played American music. Big band swing, voices singing in English about love and moonlight, and going home soon. "This is how they break you," an older man named Sergeant Otto Kessler muttered. "With comfort, with softness. Then we become weak, like them." But the weakness never appeared. Morning came early. 5:30 a.m. roll call in the compound yard. Frost still on the ground, breath visible in cold air. Guards counted the prisoners with efficient precision, then directed them to the mess hall. This was where the second great shock occurred. The mess hall was a long building with screened windows and rows of tables. Men filed in expecting thin soup, black bread, the starvation rations that defined wartime Germany. Instead, they found trays loaded with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, butter, oatmeal, coffee with real cream, fresh apples. Werner stared at his plate as if it might be poisoned. Around him, men sat frozen, afraid to believe what they were seeing. One prisoner, a young private named Hans, who hadn't eaten real meat in 6 months, began to shake. His hands trembled as he reached for the bacon. An American guard serving the line noticed their hesitation. He spoke no German, but his gesture was universal. He mimed eating, nodded, moved on to the next man. Permission granted. The prisoners ate like men remembering what it meant to be alive. Some became sick from eating too fast after months of poor rations. Others ate slowly, deliberately, each bite a small ceremony of disbelief. The bacon was salty, crisp with fat. The eggs were hot and fluffy. The coffee was strong and bitter and perfect. In Germany, civilians were eating turnip soup and ersatz bread made from sawdust and chestnuts. Here, prisoners of war ate better than German officers. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. The work assignments came after breakfast. Men were organized into crews of 20, assigned to local farms based on experience and physical capability. Werner's group was sent to the Morrison farm, 640 acres of corn and soybeans 15 miles from camp. They rode there in trucks, watching Iowa landscape roll past. Farmhouses that would have been manor homes in Germany. Barns with metal roofs that didn't leak, fences maintained with precision. James Morrison was waiting when they arrived. He was 56, a man weathered by decades of farming, with hands that showed a lifetime of work and eyes that assessed the German prisoners the way he'd assess new equipment. Useful or not useful, that was all that mattered. "Welcome to my farm," he said through the translator. "We've got spring planting starting. You'll be operating equipment, preparing fields, following instructions from my regular hands. Work hard, and we'll get along fine. Slack off, and you'll find yourself on a different crew doing different work that's considerably less pleasant." Then Morrison walked them to the equipment barn. This was where everything changed. The John Deere Model D tractor sat in the barn like a green and yellow cathedral. It was massive, standing taller than a man, with rear wheels 5 feet in diameter and an engine block the size of a small car. But it was the implement behind it that made Werner's breath catch. A 12-bottom plough, steel blades gleaming, designed to turn 12 furrows simultaneously across fields, measured in hundreds of acres. "Gott im Himmel," Klaus whispered. "Good God in heaven." Werner had commanded Tiger tanks, the most advanced armoured vehicles Germany produced. 60 tons of steel and firepower, machines that required perfect engineering and months of specialised training to operate. This tractor was larger, not in weight, but in sheer presence. And it was civilian equipment, a tool for growing food. Morrison started the engine. The sound was enormous, a deep thrumming that Werner felt in his chest. Not the high-pitched scream of a tank engine pushed to its limits, but something steady, powerful, designed to run 12 hours a day, every day, for years without major maintenance. "This here's just a standard tractor," Morrison said, pride evident despite the language barrier. "Got 8 of them, plus 3 combines for harvest, 2 grain trucks, and a couple smaller tractors for detail work." 8. One farmer had 8 tractors. Werner tried to calculate what that meant. A single American farmer had more mechanized equipment than some German Panzer companies. And this was normal. This was standard American agriculture. Morrison demonstrated the tractor, showing how one man could plough an area that would take 100 men with horses a week to prepare. The machine moved across the field with inexorable steadiness, engine never straining, pulling those 12 ploughs through soil like they weighed nothing. In Germany, farmers still used horse-drawn ploughs. Most Wehrmacht logistics still relied on horses. The modern German army moved on 4 legs as often as it moved on wheels and tracks. "You'll learn to operate these," the translator said, conveying Morrison's words. "Some of you will be on tractors, others on implements, others on support work. We've got 2 months to get crops in the ground, and I'm not paying you camp boys to stand around looking impressed." But impressed didn't cover it. Werner had believed, absolutely believed, that German engineering was superior, that German precision and quality outmatched American mass production, that what Americans built in quantity, they lacked in sophistication. Every propaganda film, every officer briefing, every piece of information he'd received for years had reinforced this belief. This tractor destroyed that belief completely. It wasn't crude, it wasn't simple, it was brilliantly engineered, designed for reliability and ease of maintenance, built with tolerances that would shame many German military vehicles, and it was one of millions. American farms had more tractors than Germany had tanks. The work began the next morning. Werner was assigned to a tractor crew, learning to operate the massive machines under the supervision of Morrison's regular farmhands. These men were civilians who'd been deferred from military service due to the critical importance of food production. They treated the German prisoners with a mixture of wariness and pragmatic acceptance. Not friends, but not enemies either. Just workers doing a job. The lead farmhand was a man named Earl Thompson, 45 years old, built like the equipment he operated, with hands scarred from decades of farm work and a teaching style that was gruff but patient. He caught Werner staring at a tractor's engine one morning, clearly trying to understand its construction. "She's a beauty, ain't she?" Earl said, his voice carrying a note of pride. The translator rendered his words. 2-cylinder horizontal engine. Runs on damn near anything, gasoline, kerosene, even tractor fuel that's basically kerosene with additives. 475 RPM at full load. Simple as hell to maintain. You can practically rebuild the whole engine with a hammer and a wrench. Werner listened, fascinated despite himself. How many of these exist? Earl laughed. John Deere alone's made over 100,000 Model Ds since 1923, and that's just one model from one company. You got International Harvester, Case, Alice Chalmers, Minneapolis Moline, Massey Harris, Oliver, Cockshut. Hell, there's probably 2 million tractors working American farms right now. 2 million. Werner did the mathematics instinctively. Germany's entire tank production from 1939 to 1944 was less than 50,000 vehicles. America had 40 times that number in farm tractors alone. And those tractors represented manufacturing capacity, industrial sophistication, mechanical knowledge, distributed across a civilian population that could be converted to military production if needed. Actually, it was being converted. Earl mentioned it casually while showing Werner how to adjust the plough depth. My cousin works at the John Deere factory in Waterloo. They switched over to making tank transmissions and artillery shells last year. Whole production line converted in about 6 months. They figure they'll switch back to tractors once we're done whipping you boys. The casual confidence in that statement, once we're done whipping you boys, carried more weight than any propaganda speech. This wasn't bravado. It was statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who understood industrial capacity at a fundamental level. Werner spent his first week learning to operate the Model D, understanding its controls, feeling how it responded to different soil conditions. The learning curve was steep but manageable. What wasn't manageable was the psychological impact of understanding what these machines represented. Every day, driving that tractor across fields measured in hundreds of acres, Werner confronted the mathematical reality of American industrial capacity. One evening after work, exhausted and covered in field dust, Werner sat outside his barracks, watching the sunset paint Iowa sky in shades of orange and gold. Klaus joined him, equally tired, carrying the stunned expression that had become common among the prisoners. "I have been thinking," Klaus said quietly in German, making sure no guards were close enough to overhear, "about what we see here, about what it means. And we were told America was weak, that they couldn't build anything of quality, that their soldiers were cowards and their industry was inefficient." Klaus paused, searching for words. "Werner, one farmer has 8 tractors." 8. Do you understand what that means for their military production? Werner understood perfectly. He'd been doing the same calculations for a week. It means we never had a chance. Not really. Not if they decided to fight seriously. But surely the Führer knew. Surely our intelligence services understood American capacity. Werner wasn't sure how to answer that. He'd believed in German superiority because everyone around him believed it. Because every official source confirmed it. Because the alternative, that they'd been lied to about something so fundamental, was too devastating to contemplate. But now, sitting in Iowa, watching the sun set over fields worked by machines that made German equipment look primitive, the alternative was becoming unavoidable. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It came in small moments, accumulating like water wearing away stone. A guard named Corporal Mike Chen, whose parents had emigrated from China, taught some of the younger Germans to play baseball in the evenings. He was patient, demonstrating the grip, the swing, laughing when they missed, celebrating when they connected. His joy was uncomplicated, genuine. Hans, the young private, asked him why Americans were kind to prisoners. "Your people," Chen said simply, through the translator. "Being prisoners doesn't change that. Besides, the war's gonna end eventually. Better we all remember how to be human when it does." In the camp library, yes, they had a library, prisoners discovered American magazines, newspapers, technical journals. They read about American factory production, about shipyards building Liberty ships in weeks, about aircraft plants producing bombers on assembly lines, about steel mills operating at capacity unimaginable in bombed German industry. And slowly, painfully, they began to understand the magnitude of their nation's miscalculation. Werner found a 1943 copy of Fortune magazine with an article about agricultural mechanization. The statistics were staggering. America had mechanized 90% of its wheat harvest. Corn planting was 80% mechanized. One American farmer produced enough food to feed himself and 14 others. In Germany, it took 4 farmers to feed the same number of people. This meant American agriculture freed vast numbers of men for military and industrial work. Germany's agricultural inefficiency tied up millions in food production who could never be spared for factories or front lines. The implications cascaded through Werner's understanding like dominoes falling. Otto Kessler, the older sergeant who still clung to Nazi ideology, found Werner reading the magazine. "Propaganda," he sneered. "American lies to make themselves look strong." Werner looked up slowly. "Otto, we're eating better as prisoners than we ate as soldiers. We're working with equipment more advanced than our military vehicles. We're in a country that hasn't been bombed, that has more cars than we have soldiers, that produces tractors like we produce propaganda speeches. At what point does propaganda become observable reality?" Otto's face reddened. "You're becoming weak, soft, accepting their lies. I'm accepting what I can see with my own eyes. Something we should have done before we started this damned war." The argument attracted attention from other prisoners. Some agreed with Otto, clinging to old beliefs because the alternative was too painful. Others nodded at Werner's words, recognizing truth they'd been avoiding. The camp was becoming divided between those who could adapt and those who couldn't. But the evidence kept accumulating. In June, Morrison took Werner and several other prisoners to a neighbouring farm to help with early hay harvest. The neighbour, a man named Peterson, had just purchased a new International Harvester combine. The machine was enormous, a self-propelled monster that cut, threshed and cleaned grain in a single pass, dropping the finished product into a trailing truck. Peterson was enthusiastic about demonstrating his new equipment. "Cost me $3,500, he said proudly. "But she'll harvest my wheat in a third of the time with a quarter of the labour. Already got her paid off in my head." $3,500. Werner knew from camp script calculations that was equivalent to about 14,000 Reichsmarks. A farmer could casually purchase equipment worth more than a skilled German worker would earn in a decade. And this was normal. This was expected. This was American agriculture operating under wartime conditions. The combine moved through Peterson's wheat fields with mechanical precision. Werner watched, doing calculations. This machine could harvest more grain in an hour than a company of men with scythes could harvest in a week. Multiply that by thousands of combines across millions of acres, and you got food production capacity that could feed armies, civilian populations, and still have surplus to ship to allies. Germany was starving. Werner knew this from letters that had started arriving from home. His wife described ration cards that provided barely enough calories to survive. His mother wrote about standing in lines for hours to buy bread made from potato flour and sawdust. His sister had stopped writing entirely, and Werner feared what that meant. Here, prisoners ate 3 meals a day. The guards ate even better. Local civilians ate abundantly. America was feeding itself, feeding its military, feeding Britain and the Soviet Union, and still had enough food that farmers competed with each other over equipment purchases. The psychological inversion was almost unbearable. Werner had fought for Germany, believing he was defending a superior nation against inferior enemies. Now he stood in an Iowa wheat field, a prisoner operating equipment that proved everything he'd believed was a lie, eating better than his family in victorious Germany. One evening in late June, a violent thunderstorm rolled through Iowa. Rain so heavy it turned the camp roads to mud, lightning that seemed to split the sky, thunder that reminded Werner of artillery barrages in North Africa. Some of the younger prisoners huddled in their bunks, remembering bombing raids that had destroyed German positions. The American guards came through the storm, checking barracks, moving men to drier buildings, bringing hot coffee and blankets. Corporal Chen found Werner sitting alone in darkness, staring at nothing. "Remind you of the war?" Chen asked gently through a translator who'd come along. Werner nodded. "Everything reminds me of the war, but not how you might think." "How then?" "I think about the equipment we used, the tanks I commanded. We thought they were the best in the world. Tiger tanks, 60 tons of armor and firepower. Took 6 months to build one. Took specialized factories, skilled workers, resources we could barely spare. And they broke down constantly. Transmissions failed. Engines overheated. We spent more time maintaining them than fighting with them." Werner paused, searching for words. "Then I come here, and I see tractors, civilian equipment, and they're more reliable than our tanks, easier to maintain, produced in quantities we could never match, and I realize we were building the wrong things. Focusing on quality over quantity, on sophistication over reliability. We were craftsmen trying to fight an industrial war. We brought swords to a gunfight." Chen listened without judgment. "You can't change what's past, but you can learn from it." "Learn what? That everything I believed was wrong? That I fought for a lie? That my friends died for nothing?" "Learn that people matter more than ideology. That practical truth beats comforting lies. That building things is better than destroying them." Chen gestured at the storm outside. "This'll pass. The war will pass. Question is who you'll be when it's over." In July, something remarkable happened. Morrison invited several of the German prisoners to his house for Sunday dinner. This was unusual. Fraternization between prisoners and civilians was technically discouraged. But Morrison had approval from Major Harrison, who understood that building connections between Germans and Americans served denazification better than lectures. Werner was among those invited. He walked into Morrison's farmhouse expecting something modest, remembering German farmhouses with their worn furniture and limited space. What he found redefined his understanding of American prosperity. The house was enormous by German standards. Multiple bedrooms, indoor plumbing with hot running water, electric lights in every room, a kitchen with a refrigerator and electric stove, a living room with a radio and telephone. The furniture was comfortable, well made. Photographs on the walls showed Morrison's family, sons in military uniform, a daughter at college, grandchildren. Morrison's wife, Helen, had prepared dinner. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables from their garden, apple pie for dessert. "Not a special meal," she explained through the translator. "Just Sunday dinner. Normal. Standard." Werner ate slowly, carefully, trying not to show how overwhelmed he felt. This farmer and his wife lived better than German professionals, better than many German officers. They had amenities that would be luxuries in Germany: a refrigerator, a telephone, a car in the garage. And they considered this normal working-class life. After dinner, Morrison took Werner to his office, a small room lined with farming journals and account books. He pulled out a ledger, showing Werner the farm's financial records. "I want you to understand something," Morrison said. "This farm produces about 25,000 bushels of corn and 8,000 bushels of soybeans annually. I sell most of it, keep some for seed and animal feed. After expenses, I clear about $8,000 profit in a good year." $8,000. About 32,000 Reichsmarks. More than a German factory worker would earn in 15 years. And Morrison was just one farmer among millions. "Before you invaded Poland," Morrison continued, his voice serious, "I was against getting involved in European wars. Figured it wasn't our problem. Then you started killing Jews, conquering countries, threatening everything decent people built. And I realize some fights you can't avoid, some evil you have to stop." He paused, looking directly at Werner. "I don't hate you personally. You're just a soldier who followed orders. But your government made a choice to start a war with countries that had more people, more resources, more industrial capacity. It was stupid, suicidally stupid, and a lot of good men on both sides died because your leaders couldn't do basic mathematics. Werner found he couldn't argue. Morrison was right. The numbers didn't lie. Germany had 80 million people. America had 130 million. The Soviet Union had 170 million. Britain and its empire added hundreds of millions more. Germany and its allies were outnumbered at least 4-1. And that was before calculating industrial capacity, resource access, agricultural production. "Why are you telling me this?" Werner asked. "Because when you go home, you'll tell others. And maybe enough Germans will learn that starting wars against the whole world is a damned fool idea. Maybe next time someone starts talking about racial superiority and living space and destiny, enough people will remember what actually happened and say no." That night, Werner wrote in his notebook, "Today, I ate dinner with a farmer who earns more than a German professional, lives better than most German officers, and produces more food with 8 men than 100 Germans produce with horses and hand tools. The war is not being lost on battlefields. It was lost before the first shot was fired. In the mathematics of industrial capacity, we chose to ignore." August brought news of the Allied invasion of France, of German retreats, of cities being bombed, of the war moving inexorably toward Germany itself. In Camp Morrison, they'd started calling it that informally. This meant uncertainty. Would prisoners be sent home? Kept in America? Moved to Europe for reconstruction work? The anxiety rippled through the barracks. Some men hoped to stay, afraid of what waited in Germany. Others desperately wanted to return despite everything, to find family, to start rebuilding. Major Harrison called an assembly in the camp square. He stood on a platform, late summer sun brutal overhead, his uniform showing patches of sweat. The prisoners stood in formation, waiting. "The war in Europe is moving toward conclusion," he said, and the translator rendered his words into German. "When it ends, you will be repatriated. That could be months from now, could be longer. Until then, camp operations continue as before." He paused, looking out over the assembled men. "I want you to understand something. When you return to Germany, you will tell people about your time here. Some won't believe you. Some will say you're lying or that you've been brainwashed by American propaganda. But I need you to tell the truth anyway." The prisoners listened, silent. "Tell them that American farmers have equipment more advanced than your military vehicles. Tell them that American industrial capacity is so vast that we fought a 2-ocean war while raising living standards at home. Tell them that the ideology that brought you here was built on lies about American weakness and German superiority." His voice grew stronger. "Your government started a war based on racial theories and territorial ambitions. Millions died, cities burned, entire peoples were targeted for extermination. That is what happens when you build policy on lies and hatred. That is what happens when you believe comfortable myths instead of uncomfortable truths." The silence was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. "We're sending you home to rebuild. Don't rebuild the same world. Build something honest. Build something based on truth instead of propaganda. Build something that feeds people instead of feeding them into wars. That's the only way any of this matters. That's the only way those millions didn't die for nothing." Major Harrison stepped down. The assembly was dismissed. That evening, Werner sought out Earl Thompson. He found him in the equipment barn, performing maintenance on one of the tractors, the kind of routine work that kept machines running for decades. "I need to tell you something," Werner said in careful English. His language skills had improved considerably over months of immersion. Earl looked up from his work. "Go ahead." "When I came here, I believed Germany was superior, that our equipment, our engineering, our culture was better than yours. I believed Americans were weak, that you couldn't fight, that you won through numbers alone, not quality." He paused, searching for words. "I was wrong. Completely, devastatingly wrong. What I thought was American weakness, your focus on reliability, on mass production, on practical solutions, is actually strength. Real strength. the kind that wins wars and builds prosperity. We were so focused on being the best that we forgot to ask if we were building enough. Earl listened, his expression unreadable. Took you a while to figure that out? Yes. And I'm more ashamed than I have words for. Not just about being wrong, but about what we did because we were wrong. The war we started, the people we hurt, the lies we believed because they made us feel superior. The silence stretched. A cricket started chirping somewhere in the barn's darkness. I can't forgive you, Earl said finally. That's not my place. The people who suffered under your government, who died in camps and battles, they're the ones you need forgiveness from. And most of them are gone. Then what do I do? You live different. You build different. When you go home and people start talking about the old ways, about racial superiority, about destiny and living space, you speak up. You say no. You say, I've seen what actually works, and it's not that. You become the kind of person who would have stopped this madness before it started. He turned back to the tractor. And you remember that machines like this, tools for building and feeding people, they're worth more than all your tanks ever were. Real strength is feeding your people. Real victory is peace and prosperity. Everything else is just dying for lies. Repatriation began in October. Groups of prisoners were processed, given paperwork, loaded onto trucks heading back to ports. Werner's group was scheduled for early November. The last days at Camp Morrison felt strange. Men wandered the compound trying to memorize it, understanding they were leaving safety for chaos. Germany was a destroyed nation, occupied by foreign powers, its cities rubble, its economy collapsed, its future uncertain. On the final evening, many prisoners and guards gathered informally in the camp square. There was no official ceremony, just people saying goodbye. Some prisoners shook hands with guards. A few embraced, boundaries dissolving now that the relationship was ending. Most simply nodded, acknowledging what had passed between them. Hans approached Corporal Chen, the guard who'd taught him baseball. He'd learned enough English to say, "Thank you for showing me America is not what they told us." Chen smiled. "You take care of yourself over there. Build something good with what you learned." Werner found Earl one last time. They stood in the equipment barn where Werner had spent so many hours learning to operate machines that had changed his understanding of everything. "I will remember this place," Werner said. "I will remember what you taught me about machines, about truth, about what actually matters." "Remember what you learned," Earl corrected gently. "I just showed you equipment. You figured out the rest yourself. Will you remember me?" Earl considered this. "I'll remember that people can learn, that even after believing lies, there's still hope for truth. That's what I'll carry forward." They shook hands formally, the gesture carrying weight beyond its simplicity. The next morning, trucks came before dawn. Prisoners loaded their few possessions, some clothes, letters from home, notebooks filled with observations that would have been impossible to imagine a year before. They filed out of the camp gates, past the guard towers, past the wire fences that had held them. Major Harrison stood at the gates, saluting as they passed. A small gesture, but significant. Respect offered even to defeated enemies. The ship back to Europe carried 200 German prisoners from various camps across America. During the crossing, they told stories, compared experiences, tried to prepare for what awaited. Some men had been in camps where treatment was harsh, where guards were cruel, where conditions were difficult. They were bitter, unchanged, ready to resurrect the old ideology as soon as possible. But the prisoners from agricultural camps told different stories. Stories of American farmers with equipment that outmatched German military vehicles. Stories of being fed better as prisoners than they'd eaten as soldiers. Stories of learning that everything they'd been taught about American weakness was a lie. Some of the bitter prisoners didn't believe them, called them traitors, brainwashed, weak. But others listened, thoughtful, perhaps beginning their own reconsideration. Werner stood at the ship's rail as the coast of Europe appeared, grey and cold under November skies. Beside him, Klaus shivered in his thin coat. "Are you afraid?" Klaus asked. "Yes, but not of what I was afraid of before." "What do you mean?" Werner watched the coastline grow closer. "Before I was afraid of losing the war, of being defeated, of Germany being destroyed. Now I'm afraid we won't learn from being defeated. That we'll rebuild the same lies, the same beliefs about superiority and destiny, that all of this will have been for nothing." "Then we help each other," Klaus said. "We remember together. We tell the truth, even when people don't want to hear it." The ship docked in France, and the prisoners began their journey back to a Germany many barely recognized. In the years after the war, Werner Schultz became an agricultural engineer in West Germany, working to modernize farming techniques. He imported American equipment, taught German farmers about mechanization, wrote articles about agricultural efficiency. And he told his students about Iowa, about tractors larger than tanks, about learning that real strength is building, not destroying. Klaus Hoffmann returned to Bavaria and opened a machinery repair shop. He specialized in tractors and farm equipment, bringing American reliability principles to German engineering traditions. When old neighbors asked how he could work with American designs after fighting against America, he said simply, "Because they work. Because building things that actually function matters more than pride. Because we lost the war in factories and fields long before we lost it on battlefields." Major Robert Harrison continued serving in the army, overseeing reconstruction efforts in post-war Germany. He never spoke publicly about his time running prisoner camps. But he kept letters from some of the German prisoners, letters thanking him, letters describing how American farms had taught them more about why Germany lost than any military analysis could have. Earl Thompson returned to farming after the war, never leaving Iowa, never seeking recognition for his role in changing minds. When asked years later about the German prisoners who worked his farm, he said, "They were just men who'd been lied to, showed them the truth through tractors and honest work." Sometimes that's all it takes. What happened in agricultural camps across America was not widely known for decades. It didn't fit comfortable narratives about victory and defeat. It was too practical, too mundane, too focused on machinery instead of heroism. But it was real. German prisoners worked American farms, operated American equipment, and confronted evidence that destroyed their beliefs about national superiority. Those encounters between men who'd been taught that Germans were naturally superior and farmers who showed them machinery that proved otherwise became a small but significant part of denazification. Not the official program of lectures and films, but something more concrete. The simple experience of having your deepest beliefs contradicted by observable reality. Historians later noted that German prisoners held in American agricultural regions returned home with complex perspectives. They had seen a country that was simultaneously imperfect, with racial problems and economic inequality, yet more prosperous and productive than German propaganda admitted. They had experienced the disconnect between what they'd been told about America and what actually existed. These experiences didn't instantly create Democrats or American sympathizers, but they planted seeds of doubt about totalitarian ideology. They proved that propaganda could be overcome by direct observation. They demonstrated that measuring strength by actual capacity, rather than racial theory, produced more accurate results. The camp where Werner Schultz spent 18 months no longer exists. The barracks were torn down decades ago. The land returned to farming, which seemed appropriate. If you visited the site today, you would see only fields, perhaps a historical marker noting that a POW camp once stood there. But the impact of what happened in that space ripples forward. Every German farmer Werner taught about mechanization. Every student Klaus trained to maintain equipment properly. Every person who heard these stories and chose to measure nations by what they could build, rather than myths about superiority. The German prisoners who encountered American agricultural machinery for the first time expected primitive equipment operated by an inferior people. They found machines more sophisticated than their military vehicles. They expected confirmation of their propaganda. They found evidence that everything they believed was wrong. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something extraordinary happened. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but real. People changed their understanding. People learned to measure strength by actual capacity instead of comfortable lies. People chose to build their futures on truth instead of mythology. That is the quiet victory that no army can achieve. That is the transformation that happens one person at a time, one observation at a time, one moment of recognition that your enemy is not weak, just different. In the end, it wasn't American military might alone that defeated Nazi ideology in those prisoners' hearts. It wasn't re-education programs or denazification lectures. It was the simple experience of operating equipment that proved their beliefs were wrong, of eating food that showed American prosperity was real, of working alongside farmers whose casual competence demonstrated that democracy could produce results totalitarianism only promised. That is the lesson that echoes across decades. That is the truth that survives when all the propaganda is forgotten. That is the hope that remains when everything else has been destroyed. National strength is not determined by racial purity, military swagger, or ideological certainty. It is measured by industrial capacity, agricultural productivity, and the prosperity of ordinary citizens. It is proven by whether your soldiers eat better than enemy prisoners. It is demonstrated by whether your civilian farmers have better equipment than your military. The prisoners who left Camp Morrison in November 1945 carried that lesson home with them, back to a destroyed nation that needed to learn it more than anything else. Some shared it openly. Some lived it quietly. Some passed it on to children and grandchildren who built the new Germany on different principles. Werner Schultz died in 1987, surrounded by family in a comfortable home in Stuttgart. His grandson later found his wartime notebook, the one he'd kept hidden in his boot during the crossing to America. The final entry, written on the ship returning to Europe, read, "I went to America believing Germans were superior. I returned knowing we were fools. Real superiority is not claimed through propaganda. It is demonstrated through prosperity. Real strength is not proven by conquest. It is shown by what you build in peace. I fought for a lie. I will spend the rest of my life building truth. God willing, enough of us will do the same that Germany might become a nation worth the sacrifices made to defeat it." In the equipment barn of what was once the Morrison farm, now operated by James Morrison's grandson, there sits a restored 1943 John Deere Model D tractor. It's a museum piece now, maintained in working condition, brought out for agricultural shows and local parades. The current Morrison knows its history, knows that German prisoners once operated this exact machine, knows that somewhere in those hours of work and observation, minds changed and futures shifted. He was asked once whether it was strange, honouring a machine that had been part of re-educating enemy soldiers. He thought for a moment, then said, "It's not strange at all. That tractor did more for peace than a lot of weapons did for war. It showed the truth. Sometimes that's the most powerful thing you can do." And somewhere in Germany, in museums and private collections and still operating farms, there are tractors that trace their lineage back to American designs. Equipment built using principles German prisoners learned in Iowa and Minnesota and Kansas and brought home with them. Machines that produce food instead of destruction, that demonstrate prosperity instead of power, that prove truth can be more transformative than any weapon. The story of German prisoners seeing American tractors isn't about machines, not really. It's about the moment when mythology encounters reality and reality wins. It's about men who believed they were superior learning they were simply wrong. It's about the quiet power of observable truth to destroy even the most carefully constructed lies. That lesson remains relevant. In every era, there are those who claim superiority based on race, nation, ideology, or destiny. They build elaborate justifications, create sophisticated propaganda, marshal arguments and theories to support their claims. And sometimes, the most effective counter to those claims is not debate or rhetoric, but simply showing what actually works, what actually produces prosperity, what actually creates the kind of society where even prisoners eat well and farmers drive machines that inspire awe. The prisoners who worked American farms in 1944 and 1945 saw the future. Not because America was perfect, it wasn't. Not because democracy had no flaws, it did. But because they saw a system that, for all its imperfections, produced results. That fed its people. That created machinery civilians could operate. That built prosperity broad enough that farmers lived better than German professionals. They saw what actually winning looked like, not parades and conquests and territorial expansion, but full stores and reliable equipment and children who didn't go hungry. And seeing that, really seeing it, changed them in ways no amount of military defeat could have achieved alone. That is the untold story of World War II's prisoner of war camps. Not tales of hardship and suffering, but stories of transformation through truth, of ideology collapsing under the weight of observable reality, of men who went to war believing lies and came home carrying truth. And in a world that still produces lies about superiority and destiny and natural hierarchies, that story matters. Because it proves that truth, when clearly demonstrated, can overcome even the most deeply held propaganda. That people can change when confronted with reality they cannot deny. That building tractors bigger than tanks, feeding prisoners better than soldiers, and showing prosperity through results can be more powerful than any weapon. The German prisoners who saw those tractors for the first time thought they were seeing American excess, American waste, American inability to focus resources properly. What they were actually seeing was the future, a future where nations are measured by what they build rather than what they destroy, where strength is demonstrated through prosperity rather than conquest, where the size of your tractors matters more than the size of your tanks. Some of them learned that lesson, brought it home, built new lives on it, taught it to others, and slowly, the world became slightly better than it was. Not perfect, not redeemed, but better. That is all any of us can hope for, to learn truth when it's shown to us, to change when reality demands it, to build something better with what we learn, to pass that forward to those who come after. The tractors that changed minds in 1944 are mostly gone now, worn out or scrapped or preserved in museums. But what they represented, the power of truth to overcome lies, of reality to defeat propaganda, of observable fact to change minds, that remains, that survives, that echoes forward through every person who chooses truth over comfortable mythology, who measures strength by actual capacity, who remembers that building matters more than destroying. And somewhere, always, there will be those who need to learn that lesson. Who cling to beliefs about superiority and destiny and natural hierarchies, who build their identity on myths about being better than others. For them, the story of German prisoners seeing American tractors offers a simple truth. Reality doesn't care what you believe. Industrial capacity doesn't bend to ideology. Prosperity cannot be created through propaganda. And sooner or later, lies encounter truth. The question is only whether you can change when that encounter happens, whether you can let go of comfortable myths when faced with uncomfortable facts, whether you can rebuild your understanding on truth instead of doubling down on lies. The prisoners who worked American farms faced that question. Some answered well, some didn't, but enough changed that their transformation rippled forward, affecting families and communities and eventually nations. Enough learned that their story became proof. People can change. Truth can win. Reality matters more than propaganda. That is the legacy of tractors bigger than tanks. That is the lesson of prisoners who became witnesses to truth. That is the hope that survives when everything else is destroyed. We can learn, we can change, we can build something better. All we need is the courage to see what's actually there, rather than what we've been told to see. The humility to admit when we're wrong, and the strength to rebuild on truth instead of lies. The tractors showed the way, the prisoners learned the lesson, and the world slowly began to change. That is the story that needed to be told.